Picture a woman standing at her kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, making coffee for two people, while her phone sits face down on the table because 3 weeks ago she found a message she was never supposed to see. Her husband is upstairs getting ready for work. In an hour, he will kiss her goodbye. Tonight, he will come home, and they will sit at the same table, sleep in the same bed, and get up tomorrow and do it again. Nobody outside that house knows what she knows. And here is the part that took me a long time to sit with when I first started reading the research for this episode. She is not confused about what happened. She is not in denial in the way we usually mean that word. She knows. And she is still there. I'm Esther Adams, and this is Strides to Solutions. If this is your first time with us, welcome. What we try to do on this show is take research that usually stays locked inside academic journals, the kind of language most of us would never willingly sit down and read, and actually walk through it together until it makes sense. Not the simplified version, the real version translated. This episode opens a series I've been wanting to do for a while now on betrayal trauma, specifically the kind that happens inside a marriage where the infidelity is not a closed chapter. It is still open, still happening, or so recently stopped that the person can't yet tell the difference. Over the coming episodes, we're going to go deep into different pieces of this experience. Today, I want to lay the foundation because there is a specific psychological framework that explains something a lot of people find hard to explain even to themselves, which is simply this: why does someone stay, fully aware, next to the person who is hurting them? The instinctive explanation most of us reach for first is some version of weakness. She must not value herself. He must be in denial. They must be scared to be alone. And look, fear of being alone is real, and it does play a role for some people. But when researchers who study this closely looked at what was actually happening psychologically, the weakness explanation didn't hold up. What they found instead was something closer to a trap built into the architecture of attachment itself. And once you understand the trap, the behavior stops looking irrational and starts looking like exactly what a human nervous system does when it's placed in an impossible position. The foundational work here comes from a psychologist named Jennifer Freed, and the framework is called Betrayal Trauma Theory. The core idea is deceptively simple once you hear it, though it took real theoretical work to articulate. Trauma affects a person differently depending on their relationship to the person who caused it. If a stranger harms you, your nervous system is free to respond the way evolution built it to respond, which is to get away from the danger as fast as possible. But if the person who harms you is also the person you depend on for survival, whether that dependence is emotional, financial, practical, or some combination of all three, then getting away from the danger means losing the very relationship that keeps your life functioning. So the nervous system faces a genuine conflict. Full awareness of the threat would normally trigger flight, but flight would mean losing an attachment the person may still need or love, or simply cannot yet imagine living without. Researchers describe the psychological adaptation that emerges from this conflict as betrayal blindness, and it shows up as a kind of partial knowing, a minimizing of what's being noticed, a tendency to explain away evidence almost as fast as it appears. It is not stupidity, and it is not weak character. It functions as a survival strategy, and it makes a strange kind of sense once you accept the starting premise, which is that this person's brain is trying to preserve a relationship it still needs, while somehow also processing information that the relationship is actively dangerous. Now, before I go further, I want to be precise about something because precision matters more here than almost anywhere else in psychology. Infidelity itself is not classified as what's called a criterion of trauma in the diagnostic manual psychiatrists use. That term refers to trauma involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, and infidelity doesn't automatically meet that bar. Researchers who study this have been careful to point that out. And yet, when you look at the actual symptom profiles betrayed partners report, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, hypervigilance, avoidance, emotional numbing, The overlap with post traumatic stress is substantial enough that it's become its own subfield, sometimes discussed under the heading of non criterion A trauma. What that tells us is something important about how trauma actually works in the brain. It is not primarily the objective severity of an event that determines whether someone develops trauma responses. It is much more about the relational context the event occurred in, particularly whether the person who caused the harm is also someone the survivor depends on. That distinction between what technically qualifies as trauma on paper and what the nervous system actually experiences as trauma is going to matter for almost everything else we talk about today. So let's talk about what happens when that trauma doesn't get to become a memory because it hasn't finished happening yet. If infidelity has ended and been disclosed, even though the pain can still be enormous, there is at least a shape to the experience. There was a before, there was an event, there is eventually an after, however difficult that after turns out to be. But when the infidelity is ongoing, still active, denied when suspected, or only ever partially admitted through what researchers call trickle truth, the person doesn't get to move into a genuine post trauma phase. What they're living in instead is something closer to continuous traumatic stress. This is a subtle but important distinction. The threat has not resolved. It's not that the body is remembering danger from the past. The body may be responding, quite accurately, to danger that is still present in the house right now. The unfaithful spouse might still be leaving unexplained, guarding their phone, changing details in their story, or pressuring the other person to simply stop asking questions. And when the threat hasn't ended, healing genuinely can't complete, because healing from trauma generally requires some baseline of safety and predictability to build on. You cannot fully process a wound that keeps reopening. This is where attachment theory becomes essential to understanding what's actually happening between two people who are still living together. In healthy relationships, attachment figures function as what psychologists sometimes call a safe haven, meaning they're the person you turn to when you're distressed in order to feel calmer. After betrayal, that same person becomes simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of the threat, which creates what's sometimes described as an approach avoidance conflict. And I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of the whole experience. The betrayed partner might reach for reassurance, feel briefly soothed, then remember what happened and feel a wave of anger or disgust, then withdraw, then panic about the distance they just created, then move back toward the spouse again. From the outside, this can look erratic, even contradictory, but it isn't contradiction. It's an attachment system trying, quite logically, given its wiring, to get safety from the exact relationship where safety was damaged. There's no other switch to flip. The nervous system doesn't have a second attachment figure standing by to provide comfort instead. It only has this one. Let's get into what's actually happening physiologically because I think this part often gets talked about in vague language, phrases like your nervous system is on high alert, without really explaining the mechanism underneath. Once someone learns that a significant part of their reality was hidden from them, their threat detection system tends to recalibrate, and it recalibrates toward vigilance. Because the lesson the brain just learned accurately is that ordinary looking situations can conceal danger. So things that used to be neutral, a phone turned face down, a slightly delayed text back, a change in tone of voice, an unexplained charge on a bank statement, start registering as possible threat signals. The person might find themselves checking messages, tracking locations, reviewing bank statements, studying facial expressions for anything that doesn't quite match what's being said. Seen from outside, this can look obsessive, even controlling. But functionally, it's an attempt to restore predictability in an environment where predictability has already been proven false once. The nervous system has essentially learned a rule, which is that what I don't know might hurt me, and hypervigilance is the exhausting, imperfect strategy it's using to comply with that rule. Alongside hypervigilance, there's often a broader activation of the body's stress response systems, the kind that shows up as a racing heart, trembling, gastrointestinal distress, headaches, disrupted sleep, appetite changes, an exaggerated startle response. People frequently describe swinging between two states that look almost opposite on the surface. One is hyperarousal, where confrontation, checking behavior, panic, and repeated questioning dominate. The other is shutdown, characterized by numbness, exhaustion, a sense of unreality, reduced speech, and difficulty making even small decisions. Both of these are trauma responses. They're not two different personalities or two different levels of coping ability. They're often the same nervous system oscillating between its two main options when a threat can't be resolved through either fighting it off or fleeing from it. This chronic activation also tends to interfere with something people don't always connect to trauma, which is executive functioning, concentration, working memory, the capacity to plan and make flexible decisions. Betrayed partners often report that they can't focus at work, they forget conversations shortly after having them, they struggle to make financial decisions, and perhaps most painfully, they can't seem to decide whether to stay or leave, and they keep changing their mind. That indecision gets read by friends and family, sometimes even by the person themselves, as a character flaw, a lack of clarity or resolve. But if you understand what chronic stress does to cognitive resources, a more accurate reading emerges. This is someone trying to make one of the largest decisions of their life while their brain's planning and decision making capacity is actively being consumed by ongoing threat monitoring. Saying, I can't think clearly, isn't an excuse. It may be a fairly literal description of what's happening in the prefrontal cortex under sustained stress. There's another layer of injury here that I think deserves its own attention because it goes beyond trust in the spouse and into something more fundamental, which is trust in one's own perception of reality. Researchers sometimes call this epistemic trust, meaning confidence in your own ability to know what's true. After discovery, people often start mentally rewalking through their own history. Was the affair already happening during that vacation? Did everyone else already know? Was that apology genuine or was it another layer of the performance? This process can look like rumination from the outside, and sometimes it is, but it also seems to serve a real function, which is an attempt to reconstruct a coherent timeline after learning that a previous version of that timeline was incomplete or false. When information comes out gradually rather than all at once, a pattern researchers refer to as trickle truth. This reconstruction process becomes far more destabilizing because each new piece of information doesn't just add detail, it changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Instead of one discovery, the person effectively lives through the shock repeatedly. When a partner responds to this by denying evidence, shifting their story, or actively working to make the betrayed person doubt their own memory or perception, some researchers use the term gaslighting, though it's worth being careful with that word. Not every disagreement or defensive reaction qualifies. The term applies most accurately when there's a repeated strategic pattern of reality distortion aimed at destabilizing someone's confidence in their own perception. When that pattern is present, qualitative research on romantic gaslighting describes something quite specific happening to the target: a diminished sense of self, a lasting mistrust of their own judgment that can persist for years, and often a retreat into relative isolation, sometimes accompanied by a kind of chronic paranoia that other people might also try to undermine or dismiss what they know to be true. That's a strikingly durable effect from something that often gets minimized in casual conversation as just an argument or a misunderstanding. Given all of this, dissociation and compartmentalization start to make more sense as adaptive rather than pathological responses, at least within limits. Betrayal trauma researchers have found that high betrayal traumas, meaning trauma caused by someone the victim depends on, are associated with more dissociation than trauma caused by strangers or by life threatening events unrelated to a trusted relationship. One plausible explanation is that dissociation allows a person to hold contradictory versions of their partner without those versions colliding constantly. The loving spouse, the deceptive spouse, the devoted parent, the person having the affair. Moving between these versions can feel abrupt and disorienting from the inside, but it may also be what allows someone to function, to attend a child's event, host family, go to work, sleep in the same bed, without being emotionally flooded every single moment. This connects closely to something psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two beliefs that don't fit together easily. My spouse loves me. My spouse is repeatedly deceiving me. The mind tends to look for ways to reduce that discomfort, sometimes by minimizing the betrayal, sometimes by focusing intensely on the partner's good qualities, sometimes by convincing itself the behavior is temporary. These aren't signs of weak character. They may be the mind's attempt to preserve some psychological coherence when every available conclusion feels unbearable. There's also a pattern that shows up when someone has tried repeatedly to change the situation and nothing has worked. They've pleaded, confronted, set boundaries, tried therapy, involved family, and each time, the underlying pattern continued anyway. Psychologists sometimes describe what follows as a version of learned helplessness, where a person gradually stops believing their actions can produce meaningful change. Nothing I do matters. I just have to get through today. From the outside, this reduced action can look like acceptance, even complacency. From the inside, it more often reflects exhaustion and the collapse of a sense of agency, which is a very different thing from actual peace. Underneath all of this sit four classic threat responses that trauma researchers describe, and I think it helps to name them clearly because people often only know one or two. Fight looks like anger, confrontation, repeated demands for evidence. Flight looks like withdrawal, immersing yourself in work, sleeping separately, quietly planning an exit. Freeze looks like paralysis, an inability to decide anything, a kind of frozen silence while still physically present in the room. And fawn, sometimes the least discussed of the four, looks like appeasement, becoming more agreeable, suppressing anger, increasing caretaking, sometimes remaining sexually available despite genuine distress, all in an effort to prevent the relationship from collapsing further. From outside the relationship, fawn responses are sometimes mistaken for consent or forgiveness. They're better understood as a survival strategy operating inside a relationship that no longer feels stable. I want to spend a moment on why some people describe these relationships as addictive in feel, because there's a real mechanism behind that description, even if the popular language around it, terms like trauma bond, gets used more loosely than the research actually supports. When a relationship alternates between distance and affection, denial and confession, cruelty and reassurance, the pattern that emerges is what behavioral psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that makes slot machines so compelling. The unpredictability of the reward is part of what makes it powerful. If relief only ever came after distress, the nervous system can learn that the very same person who causes the pain can also, unpredictably, make it stop, and that pairing tends to strengthen attachment rather than weaken it. Researchers are careful to note that the term trauma bond applies most precisely when this pattern exists, alongside a broader structure of coercion, intimidation, or control, not simply whenever someone remains attached after being hurt. But even without meeting that fuller definition, the basic mechanism of intermittent reinforcement helps explain something that otherwise looks baffling from outside the relationship, which is why someone keeps returning to a source of pain that occasionally, unpredictably, also becomes a source of relief. Now, I want to shift toward a kind of loss that doesn't get talked about nearly enough because it doesn't fit the shape we usually imagine when we think about grief. Researchers call it ambiguous loss. The marriage still technically exists. The spouse is still physically present, still in the house, still at the dinner table, but the emotional relationship the person believed they had may feel absent, divided, or no longer accessible in the way it once was. So the person is grieving someone who hasn't died and hasn't left. They may be mourning the version of the spouse they thought they knew, the exclusivity they believed they had, the meaning of years of memories that now feel uncertain, an imagined future that no longer looks the way it did. And because there's no funeral, no formal separation, nothing publicly recognized as an ending, this grief often becomes what researchers call disenfranchised. Other people don't fully recognize the person's right to mourn. You decided to stay, so why are you still upset about it? That framing implies that staying somehow cancels the injury, and the research doesn't support that at all. Staying is a decision about the relationship. Grief is a response to loss. They can, and often do, coexist in the same person at the same time. Layered on top of the grief is something distinct, which is shame, and it's worth separating shame from a closely related but different experience, humiliation. Shame is internal. It asks, what does this say about me? Was I not enough? Was I foolish not to notice sooner? Humiliation is more social. It's the experience of being exposed, lowered, or excluded in the eyes of other people, which becomes especially acute if the betrayed partner realizes that others in their social circle knew before they did. Some researchers frame the deeper injury here as a kind of moral injury, a term originally developed in trauma research to describe distress that comes from a profound violation of someone's moral expectations or sense of fairness. We made a vow, and only I was actually keeping it. I sacrificed inside an agreement the other person had secretly already abandoned. That's not simply emotional pain in the ordinary sense. It's the experience that the moral structure the relationship was supposedly built on has been violated. And that kind of injury tends to produce a particular blend of rage, disgust, and a corrosive kind of cynicism about trust in general, not only trust in this one relationship. All of this affects identity, sometimes quite deeply, because marriage tends to become woven into how people understand themselves. Chosen partner, loyal spouse, someone with good judgment, someone who knows their own life. Infidelity can rupture every one of those self concepts at once. Who am I if my marriage wasn't what I believed it was? Was I actually chosen or just convenient? Can I trust my own judgment again about this or about anything? This is part of why healing in this context isn't only a question of whether the marriage continues. It often requires rebuilding a sense of self that isn't entirely defined by someone else's choices. So far, I've mostly described what's happening inside one person. But there's a second layer to this entire picture that the research keeps circling back to, and it's arguably just as important as the internal psychology, which is what happens around this person. The silence. There is a strong social taboo around speaking openly about staying in a marriage where infidelity is ongoing, and it's worth understanding where that taboo actually comes from, because it isn't one single force. Researchers studying this describe something close to a binary most people carry around without examining it. You're either the person who leaves and becomes the self-respecting survivor, or you're the person who stays, forgives, and stops talking about it. Someone who stays but continues to experience real pain doesn't fit neatly into either category, and that mismatch tends to make people around them uncomfortable. Qualitative work with injured partners who chose to stay found a very consistent pattern, which is that they conceal or heavily filter what they disclose, specifically because they anticipate being judged as weak or foolish for their decision. And notably, this anticipated judgment shapes behavior even before anyone has actually said anything critical. The fear alone does a lot of the silencing. There's also a protective instinct at work that gets overlooked. Many betrayed partners still love their spouse, or at minimum, still want to protect their reputation as a parent, a professional, a member of their community. Disclosure can feel like it risks permanent damage to that reputation, and by extension, to the family's stability, which then extends into fears about children, about custody, about financial security, about whether the family will hold together at all if the secret becomes public. So the betrayed partner frequently becomes the keeper of the very secret that's hurting them, which is its own strange psychological burden. Cultural and religious context intensifies this considerably, and the research on this is genuinely global. In some religious communities, preserving the marriage gets treated almost as a moral obligation in itself, and betrayed partners describe being encouraged to forgive quickly, pray more, and avoid what's sometimes labeled as gossip if they try to talk about what happened. Studies from ultra Orthodox Jewish communities describe religious norms like giving the benefit of the doubt and prohibitions against speaking badly of others functioning as reinforcement for secrecy, alongside a real fear of becoming a social outcast. In honor based cultural contexts, research comparing different countries found that observers attribute more blame to the person who was harmed and less to the person who caused the harm, compared with what researchers call dignity cultures. Family honor, in these contexts, is treated as something that can be damaged by disclosure itself, almost independent of whatever behavior actually caused the harm in the first place. Gender adds its own distinct pressures on both sides. Women in this research often describe internalized feelings of being stupid or somehow responsible, tied to broader cultural narratives about failing to satisfy or retain a partner. Men, meanwhile, report a different but equally isolating pattern, involving fear of appearing weak or emasculated, and research consistently finds that men reach out for support far less often than women do in this exact situation, which compounds their isolation in a different direction. What emerges from putting all of this together is something researchers describe as a genuine double bind. If you ask questions, you risk being called obsessive. If you stop asking, you remain unprotected. If you disclose what's happening, you risk judgment and losing control over your own story. If you stay silent, you remain isolated with no outside support at all. Every available option carries a real cost, and there isn't a version of this situation where the person gets to simply choose the option with no downside because that option doesn't exist. Which brings us to a question the research has actually studied with some precision, and I think this is one of the more genuinely useful findings in the whole body of work. What happens when someone does decide to disclose? Does telling someone actually help? The honest answer researchers give is that it depends enormously, not on whether disclosure happens, but on the quality of the response that follows it. When the person who receives the disclosure responds with belief, validation, and practical support, without trying to seize control of the decision, betrayed partners report an increased sense of control over their own recovery, and that sense of control is associated with a meaningful reduction in trauma symptoms over time. But when the response involves blame, minimization, or pressure, whether that's pressure to leave immediately or pressure to forgive and stay quiet, something quite specific and quite damaging tends to happen. Researchers have started calling this secondary betrayal, or in institutional contexts, institutional betrayal, and the mechanism is fairly direct. The person went looking for safety and instead received something that echoes the original harm. One study found that even a single unhelpful response from someone in a person's support network was associated with measurably worse mental health outcomes, and people frequently respond by pulling away from that relationship entirely, restructuring who they let close, sometimes ending up with a smaller support network than they had before they ever disclosed anything. This is worth sitting with for a moment because I think it reframes an assumption a lot of us carry, which is that telling someone is inherently the healthy choice and staying silent is inherently the unhealthy one. The research doesn't actually support that as a blanket rule. What it supports is something more specific. Disclosure to someone capable of responding with genuine validation tends to help. Disclosure to someone likely to respond with blame, control, or pressure can genuinely make things worse, sometimes worse than staying silent would have been, which means the betrayed partner's instinct to be selective about who they tell, to filter carefully, to sometimes withhold entirely, isn't necessarily a symptom to be corrected. In many cases, it may reflect an accurate read of their environment, an accurate prediction of how a given person is likely to respond based on real prior experience with that person or with people like them. Before I close this first episode, I want to be honest with you about where the research base actually stands, because part of what I try to do on this show is resist the temptation to make things sound more settled than they are. Most of the studies underlying everything I've described today rely on cross sectional data, meaning people were surveyed at a single point in time, which makes it genuinely difficult to establish clear cause and effect, or to track how these symptoms actually change over months and years. The samples in this research skew heavily toward women and toward North American or broadly Western populations, which limits how confidently we can generalize to men, to different cultural contexts, to same sex couples, or to more conservative religious communities. And perhaps most strikingly, when researchers went looking specifically for studies examining people who remain in a household with an actively cheating spouse, as opposed to studies about disclosure, separation, or post breakup recovery, they found remarkably little. Most infidelity research follows couples after the truth comes out and a decision gets made one way or another. Very little research follows people through the specific, prolonged experience of living inside an unresolved, ongoing betrayal, which is precisely the situation this episode has been trying to describe. That gap tells us something important in itself. This is one of the most common and most painful relational experiences people live through, and it remains one of the least studied. So, where does that leave us as we close out this first episode? I think it leaves us needing to ask a different question than the one we usually reach for. The instinctive question is, why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't he just walk away? And I hope what we've covered today makes clear why that question, however understandable, tends to miss what's actually happening. A more accurate set of questions might sound like this instead. What makes leaving genuinely costly or dangerous or emotionally unavailable to this particular person in this particular moment? What attachment, financial, cultural, and nervous system forces are actively operating on them right now? Is this relationship becoming safer over time, or is this person simply adapting to continuing harm, which are two very different things that can look identical from the outside? And maybe most importantly, does this person have access to accurate information, to some degree of safety, and to genuine informed choice? Or are they being forced to choose between leaving immediately and forgiving prematurely, with nothing honest available in between? Staying doesn't mean the betrayal didn't matter. It doesn't prove forgiveness has happened. It doesn't mean trauma isn't present. And it certainly doesn't mean consent to whatever continues to happen. What the research keeps pointing back to again and again across dozens of studies and a range of cultural contexts is that the central issue was never really whether outsiders approve of someone's decision to stay. The central issue is whether that person can recover a sense of agency, a stable grip on reality, physical and emotional safety, and genuine self respect, whether they end up staying in that marriage or eventually leaving it. That's where I want to leave this first episode. In the next installment of this series, we will move deeper into the psychological landscape of betrayal trauma, examining the less visible processes that shape how betrayal is experienced, understood, and carried over time. Thank you for being here for the beginning of this series. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions. I'll see you in the next episode.